Sometimes the world feels like it's running on invisible threads, tiny, impossible chances that line up too perfectly to ignore. A face in the crowd you've met before, a dream that unfolds into reality, a name or moment that returns years later like it was waiting. Welcome to Midnight Reddit. True stories that don't sleep. Turn down the lights, hit subscribe if you love strange, unsettling stories, and share your own in the comments. Once I lost consciousness and had this vivid experience where I saw strange symbols and people I couldn't recognize. I woke up without any real answers. Years later, I met those exact people in real life, and the symbols suddenly made sense in the context of who I had become. It felt like everything had quietly lined up behind the scenes. When I was in the early stages of dating my spouse, I took her to my hometown to meet my parents. We were flipping through an old family photo album when she pointed at a picture and asked, "How do you know this man?" I said, "That's my uncle." She replied, "No, that's my uncle." We dug into it and found out her mother's sister had married my mother's brother. We had basically been dating without realizing our families were already linked. In high school, there was this girl and we had a full-on nemesis thing going. We couldn't stand each other, but we had the same friend group. Even though we almost never hung out with that group at the same time, we kept hearing things about each other. The weird part was that our lives were almost identical. Our names were nearly the same. Like Anna and Hannah, we traveled to the same countries and cities, gone to almost all the same concerts. We're friends with the same people from another city, and we're involved in the same extracurriculars. One day in theater class, I overheard her saying she was the niece of a very famous writer in our country. I immediately challenged her, because I was genuinely the niece of that writer. We argued, messaged our families to confirm, and, sure enough, we were semi-distant cousins. We never really talked about it again. We just quietly continued disliking each other for the rest of the year. My grandmother passed away 20 years ago. She had 26 grandkids, and each one of us had a photo of her in our bedroom. 10 minutes before she passed, every one of us, in different places, sat up in bed and looked at her picture. We only realized this later when we talked about it as a family. If there's any kind of peaceful place after this life, I like to think she found it. The most interesting thing I've ever experienced happened on the day my grandfather died. I had just gotten home from school and sat in the living room. When I looked out the window, I saw my grandfather walking down the street away from the house. He was wearing his usual tan shoes, olive green pants, and his worn tan leather jacket. Even the shape of his head looked exactly like him. I said, "What's Grandpa doing outside?" My mom came to the window, saw him too, and said, "Let's go offer him some water." We walked the few steps to the front door and opened it. He was gone. The street was completely clear. There was nowhere nearby he could have hidden. No parked cars, tall hedges, or trees to duck behind. We were confused but went back inside. A few hours later, my uncle called to say my grandfather had been found in his bathroom earlier that morning and hadn't survived. So he had already passed before we saw that figure walking away from our driveway, and we only got the news afterward. We didn't know he was gone at the time, so it wasn't suggestion, stress, or expectation. We'll never know what it really was, but we both saw someone who looked exactly like him. I once drove a truck off a 50-foot bridge into a ravine. My body was severely injured, and I couldn't move much while I waited for help. Before anyone arrived, I had what felt like a calm, clear conversation with a friend who had passed away 2 years earlier in a similar type of accident. I remember it in detail even now. The experience unsettled me so much that I went searching for explanations. Strangely enough, that journey is what eventually led me to become an atheist. I found natural explanations more convincing than anything supernatural. Around the same time, my grandmother, who lived with us and loved coffee, passed away when I was 10. For 3 mornings afterward, the house smelled like fresh coffee even though no one was making any. Her favorite rocking chair would start moving slowly on its own during the TV shows she used to watch. When I was 16, I visited St. Nicholas Cathedral in Amsterdam. The moment I stepped inside, my breath caught in my chest and I felt a heavy pressure, like a presence. I'm 43 now, and I still remember that feeling vividly. Over time, I've found ways to explain my accident, the strange events around my grandmother, and even the experience in the cathedral without jumping to the supernatural. For me, just because I can't fully explain something doesn't mean I automatically assume it's proof of an afterlife. That's not how I see logic working. When I was in second or third grade, we were playing on the school playground. A group of kindergartners came to play at the same time, and for once the teachers didn't separate us. We all just played together. I noticed a little girl rushing by who looked exactly like a real-life version of one of my dolls at home. I walked up to her and asked, "What's your name?" She said, "Chloe." Then I asked how old she was. "5," she answered. My doll's name was also Chloe, and in my story, she was 5 too. I used to give all my dolls names, ages, and extremely detailed backstories. The girl ran off to keep playing, and I never saw her again, even though we were supposedly at the same school. In my freshman year of college, a bunch of people from my dorm floor used to hang out together. Another group of girls from a different floor started joining us. Right after freshman year, one of those girls became pregnant, and everyone knew who the father was. She moved back home, and he stayed in school and never really took on the role of a parent. Eventually, I lost track of both of them. Fast forward 10 years. My wife and I are living about 8 hours away from that college. She's pregnant, and we join a new parents' class to prepare for the baby. One of the dads in the class is that same guy. He's there with his wife. During introductions, each couple is asked if this is their first child. He and his wife say, very matter-of-factly, that this is their first baby. I just sat there thinking about the past, knowing it wasn't really his first. Recently, I met someone while volunteering. We had the usual quick introductions. At the end of the shift, I double-checked her name and joked that I'd probably forget, because I'm terrible with names. She said she was the same way and asked for my name again. When I told her, she paused and said, "You look just like a girl I grew up with, named my first name and my maiden name." My teenage daughter was standing beside me, quietly stunned, because hardly anyone knows my maiden name. I grew up halfway across the country from where we live now. My first name is fairly common for a mid-80s kid, but my last name was not something super common like Smith. I'm 41, and that was the first time anything like this had ever happened. Apparently, there's someone out there who looks like me and shares my exact first and last name in a completely different part of the country. I once gave some of my clothes to a friend, which was normal in our group. 5 years later, in a different state, I was browsing a thrift store and saw a familiar item on the rack. It was one of the pieces I'd gifted. I knew it was the exact same one because I had patched a small hole in a very specific way. It was clearly worn and loved, which actually made me feel oddly happy, like it had gone on its own little journey and found its way back in front of me. When I was a kid, my family lived in Baltimore, and we were close with another family whose kids were about the same age as my brother and me. Then my dad got transferred and we moved to New York. Not long after, that same family ended up living in the same town in New York. We thought that was wild, but chalked it up to coincidence. A few years later, my dad was transferred again, this time to Massachusetts. We hadn't been there long when that same family moved into our town again. At that point, coincidence started to feel like something else. Over the years, lots of people have told me they've seen my twin sister. I don't actually have a twin, although when I was 4, I remember asking my parents what they did with her because I was convinced I had one. A couple of years ago, my nephew mailed me a photo. It showed a woman who looked exactly like me holding a newborn in a hospital room. The baby's clothes on the bed and on her were clearly for a girl. I've never had a daughter. I studied the picture for a long time trying to figure it out. Eventually, I noticed the woman's hips were wider than mine have ever been. That's when I realized it wasn't me. My nephew had also realized that and sent it just to get my reaction. He found the photo tucked inside a book he bought at a secondhand bookstore. When I was 5, my uncle used to pick me up from my grandma's house and drive me to school each morning. One day my alarm went off and I woke up crying, shaken by a dream where my uncle had a car accident and his car alarm went off at the same time as my alarm. I told my grandma the dream and she couldn't calm me down, so we started praying. In the middle of that, my uncle's phone number popped up on the caller ID. It was a paramedic using his phone, telling us he was on his way to the hospital because he'd just been in a crash. In the background, we could hear his car alarm blaring. When I was in my early 20s, I drew a rough little picture of a bird on a tree branch and wrote the words, my friend's name, crashed his motorcycle on it. I taped it to my refrigerator as some kind of dark joke. 2 weeks later, that friend was in a motorcycle accident and didn't make it. I tore the drawing to pieces and threw it away. That was the day I stopped playing around with that kind of edgy humor. Some things really are too unsettling to joke about. When I was about 6, I had a serious skiing accident. I hit a tree and ended up with a badly injured collarbone, a fracture in my skull, and damage to my neck and back. Somehow I recovered with almost no lasting physical issues. I'm 22 now, and I was talking to my mom recently when the incident came up. She told me that what scared her most was that actress Natasha Richardson passed away a few months after my accident from nearly the same kind of injury. We both developed a hematoma. Mine healed, and hers turned out to be fatal. It's a strange, sobering thing to think about. When I was about 11, my parents and I started talking about getting a kitten. We spent hours thinking of names and planning a trip to the shelter the following week. I was thrilled. The next morning, a young ginger tabby appeared in our backyard window, crying to come in. Worried he might belong to someone nearby, my parents hesitated and kept their distance. But he stayed by my side the entire day while I played with friends. By evening, we let him in, fed him, gave him a name and a place to sleep. He just became part of our family. Looking back, I see it as a kind of manifestation. Since then, especially after I started spiritual practices, similar things have happened, finding lost items or seeing certain animals I'd hoped to see for the first time. I was on a date once, driving with a girl in my car. I was telling her a story about a friend of mine who had recently been rear-ended while stopped at a red light. As I was mid-story, we were pulling up to a red light ourselves when a car in the lane next to us sped forward and slammed into a stopped car. Without even thinking, I pointed and said, "It was just like that right there." It took a few seconds for both of us to process how bizarre the timing was. My brother used to buy me a tech magazine called Digit every month. He stopped doing that years ago, and I hadn't thought about it in a long time. One day, almost a decade later, the magazine randomly popped into my mind. I remembered how he used to bring it home and how excited I'd get. Several hours later, that same day, he visited our house and handed me a new issue of Digit. He said he'd seen it in a shop and suddenly remembered how he used to buy it for me, so he picked one up. I was at a natural history museum looking at a stegosaurus skeleton, specifically the spikes on its tail, the thagomizer. I started telling my friends about how that name came from a cartoon and decided to pull up the Wikipedia article to show them. The picture on the article was the exact same display I was standing in front of, from the exact same angle. I needed a hard-to-get medication approved through insurance. It took a lot of back and forth, but eventually I got an email saying it was approved. My first and last name and my age were all correct, but the city listed was wrong. I called the insurance company and they realized they'd mixed me up with someone else whose information looked very similar. Somewhere in Brooklyn, there is another person with my exact full name, my same age, and the same rare condition. I started chatting and having drinks with two guys while on vacation in Tokyo. They were also just visiting. We hung out for a bit and then went our separate ways. A week later, we were in Kyoto. We took the metro to our hotel, and as soon as we stepped out of the station onto the street, we saw them again, walking right toward us. None of us could believe the timing. My family had what we called a shadow family. They lived 1 block away, and their address was the same as ours except for the street name. So if ours was 34,827 Main Street, theirs was 34,827 Munn Street. We found out about them because our mail kept getting switched. Our last names started with the same letter and had the same number of letters. They had 2 kids the same ages as my brother and me. Our first names also shared the same first letter. We got a dog. They got a dog. Both dogs were from the same litter from a town about 250 miles away. The breeder had named them after famous people. Our dog got the first name, their dog got the last name. For about 15 years, those were the only dogs of that particular breed that I ever saw in person. Our microwave stopped working. I told my husband, we need a new microwave, and we both sighed, knowing money was tight, and we'd probably have to go without one for a while. Right then, the phone rang. It was our local grocery store calling to say we had won a contest we didn't even know we'd entered, and the grand prize was a new microwave. We all just stared at each other, wondering if our house was somehow listening in. To add a second coincidence from a friend of mine, her name is Polly, and she had a dog named Jack. One day at a lake, she heard a guy calling out her name. She responded and he said, "Oh, sorry, I wasn't calling you." Polly is my dog's name. They started talking. His name was Jack. So she was Polly with a dog named Jack, and he was Jack with a dog named Polly. They both agreed this was the kind of thing that probably wouldn't happen to them again in their lifetime. Sometimes it's not the big hauntings that stay with you, but the tiny alignments. The right name, the right face, the right moment that makes you feel like reality just winked at you. What about you? Have you ever experienced a coincidence so strange it made you question everything for a second? Midnight fades, but the stories don't. See you next time on Midnight Reddit.